Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping straight into some truly fascinating ideas from our source material. We're going to explore the surprising complexities behind our choices, delve into what makes something beautiful, and we'll take a fresh look at how cultures evolve. I've got a feeling you'll find some real food for thought in this discussion.
Absolutely. What's really striking is how these seemingly different areas, from political decisions to appreciating art, even how societies develop, they're connected by some fundamental principles about knowledge, how we create it, how we pass it on.
Interesting.
Let's start with the unexpected intricacies of making choices, shall we?
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with chapter 13. And there's this bit of historical trivia that really sets the stage. It mentions George Washington's first presidential veto back in 1792.
Right.
You might think it was some grand policy, but nope. It was about something pretty specific. How to divide up the seats in the House of Representatives among the states. The apportionment problem.
Yeah. Sounds dry, maybe.
It does sound a bit dry, but trust me, it opens up a whole can of worms about how we make collective decisions.
It really does. What's fascinating right off the bat is how a seemingly technical issue like this, well, it throws a spotlight on some of our basic assumptions about fairness, representation, when we try to decide things as a group. The book highlights that even here, with dividing seats, we had some really deep misconceptions about the nature of choice itself.
Right. It introduces this concept that an apportionment rule should stay within the quota. So if a state deserves, say, 4.35 seats based on population, you get either 4 or 5, not like 3 or 6.
Seems logical enough.
Yeah, totally logical. But then the book poses a question that, honestly, I immediately thought of. Why couldn't they just round each state's quota to the nearest whole number? I mean, it sounds like the simplest fix.
It does seem simple, very intuitive. You'd think rounding would keep the numbers pretty close, proportionally speaking. But the book uses a really clear example to show why this seemingly obvious approach actually violates a fundamental idea, the total number of seats. Remember that hypothetical scenario? 10-seat House, 4 states, one state has almost 85% of the people.
Yes, that really laid it out. So their quota is just under 8.5 seats, rounds down to 8.
Right.
Then the other 3 states, they each have just over half a seat, so they each round up to 1.
Yep, 1 each.
And boom, suddenly instead of the 10 seats you wanted to allocate, you've handed out 11.
Exactly. That extra seat just throws the whole proportionality off. The big state, which should have had roughly 8.5 out of 10, ends up with only 8 out of 11. That's a pretty big underrepresentation.
Way more than just rounding error.
Yeah, much more. The core principle here is that the exact quotas, the fractions, they have to add up to the total number of seats. Rounding can break that basic rule. So for you listening, the first key insight is that even seemingly fair, simple rules for group decisions can have these unintended, really problematic consequences.
Okay, so rounding isn't the silver bullet. Then the book talks about these reallocation schemes. Basically, moving seats around after the first calculation, like taking a seat from a smaller state and giving it to a bigger one to get the overall numbers closer to the ideal quotas. That sounds like it could work.
Sure, reallocation can definitely help bring the total number of seats back into line, and it can minimize the overall deviation from those ideal quotas across all states. But here's where it gets really interesting, and maybe a bit counterintuitive. These reallocation schemes can lead to what are called apportionment paradoxes, essentially situations where the outcome feels unfair or just plain illogical, even if the math on the overall proportions looks, better.
Unfair. In what way? Can you give an example?
Yeah, the book gives a pretty stark one. Imagine taking a seat from the very smallest state and giving it to the largest one. Now, this might reduce the overall mathematical deviation from the quotas across all states combined. Looks better on paper, maybe?
Okay.
But the result, the smallest state ends up with 0 representatives.
Wow.
Right. So even though the overall numbers might seem more proportional, a whole group of people in that smallest state gets completely shut out. No voice at all. The takeaway here, for you, is that fairness and representation isn't just about hitting precise mathematical targets. It also involves making sure everyone has some level of voice.
0 representatives.
Yeah.
Yeah, that feels profoundly unfair. Even if the overall math deviation is smaller, it really makes you stop and think, what is the main goal of representation? Is it just pure mathematical proportionality across the board? Or is there some baseline level, some minimum voice everyone deserves?
That's exactly the heart of the problem. And the book then asks this crucial question. What is the right way to measure how well a system represents people? Is the goal To minimize the total deviation everywhere, even if that means some groups get hit really hard? Or is it more important that everyone gets at least some representation, even if the overall proportions aren't perfectly mathematically aligned? It shows how the founding fathers themselves wrestled with this exact tension, the desire for proportional allocation versus the need to guarantee every state a voice. That constitutional clause, guaranteeing each state at least one representative, that was a direct compromise on this very issue.
It's amazing how even that seemingly simple guarantee ripples through the whole system of trying to be proportional. And then the book adds another layer, the concept of the will of the people, reminding us that, well, in elections, only the votes cast by eligible citizens actually count.
That's right. And that introduces another potential inconsistency, doesn't it, when you're talking about who gets represented for apportionment? Because historically, apportionment has often counted all inhabitants of a state, not just the voters, or even just the eligible voters.
Which then leads to that really significant and complex historical point. Counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for apportionment. The book is careful here. It frames it as acknowledging a historical injustice, a political compromise about power, without taking sides on, current debates. But it does draw a pretty clear parallel to today's discussions about whether undocumented immigrants should count for apportionment. It just underscores how these basic questions, who counts and how, have been central and politically charged for a very long time.
And what's crucial to grasp in that historical context, the 3/5 rule, while moral awful in its implications, was fundamentally about political power between the South and the North. Southern states wanted to count enslaved people fully to get more House seats. Northern states pushed back. The 3/5 thing was a political deal to balance that power struggle. The parallel with today's debates about counting non-citizens highlights how these population numbers directly translate into federal political influence. It's still about power.
Then the book dives into the actual historical attempts to solve this puzzle. You had Jefferson proposing his rule, seemed to favor the bigger states, and then his rival, Hamilton, comes up with a rule designed to stay within quota, be more impartial. And the shocker, Washington actually vetoed Hamilton's rule.
He did. Washington's official reason was about his reading of the word apportioned. He thought it meant simple division and rounding, and Hamilton's reallocation thing was maybe unconstitutional. However, the book points out, maybe a little cynically, the potential suspicion. Washington was from Virginia, right? The most populous state then. And Virginia would have actually lost seats under Hamilton's method. It's a stark reminder that even in these seemingly technical math-based issues, political interests can definitely play a role.
It's almost like the math was just a weapon in a bigger political fight. And the story doesn't stop there. Jefferson's rule gets junked, Webster's rule has a go, then Hamilton's rule comes back for a bit, and then chaos. These apportionment paradoxes start popping up everywhere. The population paradox, a state gains people but loses a seat.
Yeah, bizarre.
And the Alabama paradox. You increase the total number of seats in the House and a state loses a seat. I mean, it sounds completely backwards.
What's so intriguing about these paradoxes is they don't necessarily come from any deliberate bias in the rules themselves. They're just inherent quirks, unintended consequences. They pop out of the math when you try to turn those fractional quotas into whole numbers for seats. The book calls them paradoxes because these rules that seem reasonable on the surface can lead to outcomes that feel totally unreasonable, unpredictable. And while the number of seats involved might seem small, just one or two in a closely divided House, a single vote can change everything.
Exactly. One vote difference could flip major legislation. So no wonder politicians are worried. They tried to find rules to avoid these specific paradoxes, but it sounds like every time they fix one, another one just popped up somewhere else. Like squeezing a balloon. Push it here, bulge it out there.
That's a perfect analogy. And it led to some pretty chaotic attempts at compromise, like literally trying to adjust the total number of House seats until different rules just happened to agree on the state allocations. The outcome in 1871 was apparently a real mess. States felt cheated, and there was even confusion about which rule was actually used in the end.
And then the book mentions mathematicians getting involved. You'd think, okay, experts, solve this. It seems like a math problem, right? Population, seats, divide fairly. But even the top mathematicians, even the National Academy of Sciences, they kept suggesting different rules. The book says this should have been a huge clue. Fairness in political representation isn't just a straightforward math equation waiting for the right answer.
Precisely. Different fundamental ideas about what impartiality or fairness even mean in representation naturally lead you to different mathematical rules to achieve those goals.
Yeah.
And math itself can't tell us which underlying principle is the right one. The fact that even today, with the current method, the Hill method, mathematicians still debate if it inherently favors smaller states, it just hammers home this crucial point for you listening. Even seemingly objective math solutions rest on assumptions about what we value.
And here's where the book just drops this mind-blowing insight. The search for a rule that's both perfectly proportional and completely free of all these paradoxes. It's mathematically impossible. These no-go theorems, from Belinsky and Young, they show there's a fundamental limit to what we can achieve here.
This is a truly pivotal idea. It goes way beyond just dividing up seats. It connects directly to this bigger field, social choice theory, which really took off in the 20th century with this, well, really ambitious goal, creating rigorous mathematical tools to perfectly capture the will of the people, to design decision systems that were flawlessly fair. You had brilliant minds, giants like John von Neumann, trying to crack this.
Yeah, the dream was these elegant formulas, right? Take everyone's preferences, plug them in, and out pops a clear, consistent picture of what society wants.
But the reality, as the book stresses, was kind of disappointing for those initial hopes. Social choice theory kept running into these fundamental no-go theorems, like the Belinsky-Young one for apportionment, but even more famous, Arrow's impossibility theorem. These theorems essentially proved that the basic assumptions behind the idea of a perfectly consistent will of the people were logically incompatible. They just don't fit together.
Arrow's theorem, that sounds serious. Can you break down what it basically showed?
At its core, Arrow laid out 5 seemingly incredibly reasonable conditions, axioms, that any rule for combining individual preferences into a group preference should ideally meet. Things that sound like pure common sense for any fair decision process. But then, the groundbreaking and kind of disheartening result, Arrow proved these 5 reasonable axioms are logically inconsistent. You just cannot have a decision rule that satisfies all 5 at the same time. Something's got to give.
Wow. That's a fundamental roadblock, then, to the whole idea of perfectly fair group decisions.
Yeah.
A good example, one of these sensible axioms that clashes.
Sure. One is called the independence of irrelevant alternatives. Sounds fancy, but it's simple. Imagine a group choosing between pizza and hamburger, and the group prefers pizza.
Okay.
Now, if a totally new, unrelated option, say sushi, gets added to the menu, the axiom says the group's preference between the original 2 pizza and hamburger shouldn't change. Seems logical, right? Adding sushi shouldn't suddenly make the group prefer hamburger over pizza. Another key one is positive association. If more individuals start preferring pizza, the overall group preference shouldn't suddenly flip away from pizza to hamburger. Again, sounds basic for rationality.
Those do sound like fundamental requirements for any kind of rational group decision. So the fact that they can't all hold true simultaneously, that's a massive problem for this idea of a consistent will of the people.
It really is. The profound implication of Arrow's theorem is that any system where a group makes decisions together is going to be irrational or inconsistent in some fundamental way. It might effectively become a dictatorship where one person's view always wins out, or it might show preferences changing in ways that contradict the persuasion that happened. The book's conclusion from this is pretty stark. There's just no such thing as a perfectly self-consistent, coherent will of the people in the way we might intuitively think. So for you, this suggests that when we talk about what society wants or the majority prefers, we need to be really aware of these built-in limitations in how we add up individual views.
That's a pretty deep takeaway. It kind of chips away a lot of the basic assumptions we have about how democracy should work, ideally. And sounds like after Arrow, people try to find workarounds, maybe by considering how strongly people felt.
Exactly. The idea was maybe if we could measure the intensity of preferences, how much more you prefer pizza over hamburger, maybe we could build a better system that avoids Arrow's problem. But, as the book notes, actually measuring and comparing intensity across different people is incredibly hard to do reliably. And even when theorists tried incorporating intensity measures, the fundamental no-go results, variations of Arrow's theorem, they still tend to hold up. It seems like every time you try to patch one hole in a decision system, another paradox or inconsistency pops up somewhere else.
And then the discussion of the book expands to electoral systems themselves, which, it notes, are mathematically similar to apportionment, but maybe even more prone to paradoxes, and with arguably more serious real-world impacts because of, persuasion and how votes actually turn into power.
That's right. Electoral systems are all about taking the preferences voters have been persuaded to hold and turning them into a government. And proportional representation, often seen as the fairest because it tries to match seats to vote share, isn't immune to these paradoxes either. The book mentions the interesting more preferred less seats paradoxes seen in Denmark, where a majority might prefer one political bloc, but the other bloc actually gets more seats.
That's wild. So even the system designed for maximum fairness and proportionality can still give results that seem to contradict what most voters wanted. And the book also points out another quirk of proportional systems. They sometimes give huge power to smaller parties, the ones holding the balance of power in coalitions.
Precisely. Even if a small party doesn't represent that many voters overall, their support might be essential to form a majority government. That gives them leverage, influence, maybe way out of proportion to their actual vote share. The example of Germany's FDP is often used here playing kingmaker, despite not always being a huge party. And the book contrasts this with plurality voting, or first past the post, which tends to overrepresent the two biggest parties and can lead to a party winning a majority of seats with less than half the overall vote.
Plurality gets criticized for not being perfectly proportional. Yeah.
Ah.
But the book actually makes an interesting case for some of its less obvious benefits, particularly its error-correcting aspects. It argues that because only the top vote-getter wins in each area, it forces parties to develop better ideas, more persuasive arguments to win people over, and it also leads to clearer responsibility, right? The winners are more directly accountable.
That's a key point the book makes. The winner-take-all aspect of plurality can make it more sensitive to shifts in public opinion over time. The book gives that compelling example from Manitoba, Canada, in 1926. The Conservatives won the most votes nationally, but got 0 seats in Manitoba. That dramatic result arguably fueled a big political shift in the next election, a kind of self-correction. The book suggests that while plurality isn't perfect, it has drawbacks. The common idea that representative government depends on perfect proportionality might be wrong, especially in, well, more advanced political cultures.
And then it touches on the unique U.S. Senate structure. Equal representation per state, regardless of population, about as far from proportional as you can get. But the book notes something interesting. The Senate and House are relatively rarely controlled by different parties. Maybe that suggests something more is going on than just mirroring population preferences. Perhaps the dynamic of persuasion, the need to build broad coalitions in a plurality system like the House, actually leads to some convergence in political views over time. Kind of like how science builds consensus through discussion.
That's a really thought-provoking idea, that the institutions themselves might, over time, encourage consensus building and the rise of more broadly appealing ideas, even without strict proportionality. And the book wraps up this chapter by stressing that the really big historical changes in who gets represented, like women's suffrage, civil rights, arguably dwarfed the technical injustices from different apportionment methods. Ultimately, the book suggests the main point of majority rule in democracies should be to create a path towards more agreement, even unanimity, in the future, by always incentivizing better ideas. It argues that creatively changing the options, fostering open discussion, allows cooperation in ways that the strict limits of no-go theorems might suggest is impossible.
Wow, that was a truly deep dive into choices, from dividing seats to social choice theory and electoral systems. It really makes you question a lot of basic assumptions about representation. Okay, complete change of pace now. Let's turn to chapter 14. Why are flowers beautiful? This feels like a totally different world.
It does feel like a big shift, yeah. From messy politics to aesthetics and sensory experience. The chapter starts with that charming little anecdote, the author's daughter Juliet explaining wildflowers to make the world pretty and help bees make honey.
Sweet.
It's sweet, but it's the launchpad for a much deeper question. Is beauty just subjective, or could there be something objective about it?
Right. And the book brings in these powerful quotes right away. Peter Schaffer on Mozart, John Archibald Wheeler on elegant physics theories. The common thread is this quality of being hard to vary while still doing the job. The book connects this strongly to what we see as beauty or maybe elegance in both art and science.
That's really the core idea explored here. In science, an elegant theory explains a lot with few assumptions. It's resistant to tweaking without breaking. It has this internal necessity. Now, we usually think of scientific truth as objective, but for art, the common view is subjectivity, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. It's just taste. The chapter challenges this widespread belief. It asks, isn't there maybe a more objective basis for beauty than we usually admit?
It acknowledges the usual argument. Science has proofs, experiments, tests. Art doesn't. You can't really prove Mozart is objectively better than, I don't know, Stone Age drumming, or can you? That seems to be the question lurking underneath.
Exactly, and the book tackles this dismissal of objective beauty head-on. It argues it's not just some leftover from outdated empiricism, the idea that all knowledge comes from senses alone. It says, okay, aesthetic values can't be logically deduced from facts alone, but they can be linked to objective reality through the explanations we build, much like moral values are. That Wheeler quote about the beauty of a unified physics theory almost hints at this deeper link.
The chapter also deals with the criticism that art is inherently parochial, limited by our human senses, our culture. What about aliens with totally different senses? Would our art mean nothing? But the book offers interesting counterpoints, like maybe our art is a first step towards something universal. And it mentions deaf artists creating and appreciating music, and uses this analogy of prosthetic senses for potentially experiencing alien art. It really broadens your perspective on what aesthetic experience even could be.
It really does make you rethink the limits of our current understanding. And then the chapter brings in this intriguing idea. Experience itself can create artistic problems. Think about early humans with eyes, then maybe discovering paint pigments. It seems natural they'd start wondering, how can we use this paint more beautifully, more effectively? It suggests that just having certain capabilities can lead to a drive to explore and refine them aesthetically.
Which kind of echoes Bronowski's point about moral values in scientific discovery. It hints that maybe appreciating certain kinds of beauty is also tangled up with our basic drive to understand and create knowledge. And then the chapter makes this key distinction: elegance as the beauty and good explanations, separate from whether the explanation is actually true.
Right. That famous line from Keats, beauty is truth, truth beauty. The book suggests maybe it's ironic, especially next to Huxley's more pragmatic line about the tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. The chapter clarifies not all truths are elegant necessarily, but truth often turns out to be elegant. So pursuing elegance is a useful heuristic, a good guide in the search for understanding.
It also notes the surface differences between science and art, the tools, the methods, but then highlights striking similarities too, like a theoretical physicist with just paper and pencil, or Beethoven relentlessly revising his scores. It makes you wonder if deep down they're striving for something similar.
Absolutely. Which leads to really probing questions about artistic standards. Was Beethoven genuinely fixing errors based on some objective musical quality, or just meeting arbitrary cultural norms? Is there a real discernible quality difference between Beethoven and, say, Stone Age music? And are our criteria for judging art actually getting better over time? These questions really challenge the purely relativistic view.
And the chapter targets that dismissive idea that art appreciation is just, I know what I like, or only about tradition, authority, or even genetics, mentioning that Sparrow study. It questions if any logically possible aesthetic standard could really become a cultural norm or the lifelong obsession of a great artist. The critique of cultural relativism struggling to explain perceived improvements in art traditions is pretty strong.
It really pushes back against the idea that all aesthetic standards are equally valid, just dependent on context. And then the book takes on the instrumentalist view of art, that it's just a tool for non-artistic goals, like conveying info, evoking emotion, serving society. The chapter argues beauty is fundamentally in the form itself. Using that example of two similar photos, one just looks better because of the photographer's design choices.
That was effective. The second picture had a visual coherence. The first lacked, even if the subject was the same. And then it explores attraction as a potential purpose of beauty, how art can literally draw us in, make us want to linger and contemplate it.
It distinguishes this aesthetic attraction from other kinds, like gravity or a red light, while admitting everything's ultimately physics. But it argues this underlying mechanics doesn't negate objective beauty any more than it negates objective mathematical truth.
The unpredictability of truly new art is also discussed. Is it random? Or a result of knowledge creation itself? This ties back to misconceptions about empiricism seeing science as non-creative and art as irrational. And the book gives examples of humans acting against inborn preferences, fasting, abstinence, skydiving, showing attraction isn't always just innate wiring.
Exactly. We can learn to find beauty where we didn't see it, override attractions. And then finally, the chapter gets to its title question. Why are flowers beautiful?
No.
It outlines the standard science, coevolution with insects for pollination. Flowers offer nectar, insects spread pollen.
And here's the really surprising, intriguing part. These same flowers, evolved to attract insects, also happen to attract us, humans. The book stresses how rare this is shared attractiveness criteria across such different species. Think of all the animals we find hideous that are perfectly attractive to their own kind. Flowers seem to be a major exception.
It's a truly powerful observation. What explains this shared aesthetic across such a huge evolutionary gap? The book challenges the simple cultural conditioning idea. It argues we reliably find unfamiliar flowers beautiful across cultures, unlike other plant parts, suggests something deeper is going on.
And the likely reason, the book argues, is about signaling. Flowers need to send a clear, effective signal to insects across that species gap. The signals need to be reliable, hard to fake, with patterns recognizable by the insect's complex visual systems. For this coevolution to work, both the flower's design and the insect's recognition criteria need to be, well, hard to vary.
And the book proposes this really interesting hypothesis. Maybe objective beauty, with its inherent clarity, complexity, hard-to-vary structure, is actually the most effective way to signal reliably across that biological divide. So flowers evolved to embody objective beauty, insects evolved to recognize it, and it just so happens that we humans, with our sophisticated perception, share some of those same fundamental recognition criteria.
So in a way, Dawkins' daughter was partly right. Flowers did evolve to be pretty, not because the universe intended it, but because objective prettiness was a winning strategy for getting genes replicated via pollination. The book contrasts this with honey. Its attractiveness is more likely shared genetics, shared metabolism with bees.
The chapter also looks at mundane explanations for flower beauty, bright colors, symmetry, contrast, but it refutes these with counterexamples. Think of subtle white flowers, asymmetrical orchids we find captivating, or the contrast of a spider in a bath not usually seen as beautiful.
And it addresses the objection about other beautiful natural things, night sky, waterfalls that didn't co-evolve to attract us. The book argues these things, while beautiful, lack the appearance of being designed for beauty like flowers do. It uses Paley's watch analogy. The watch implies design, a stone doesn't. Flowers, the book says, have that watch-like quality regarding beauty.
It compares flowers to inscriptions in an unknown language. They look designed for a purpose, and that purpose seems related to what we call beauty, even if we don't fully get the principles. And from this, it proposes two kinds of beauty: parochial, species culture individual specific, and universal objective, like laws of physics. Creating both takes knowledge, but objective beauty needs that universal reach.
And the book suggests humans appreciate objective beauty because we are universal explainers. It draws an analogy. Signaling between species, flowers, insects, is like signaling between humans because of the knowledge gaps between us. Human artists, it argues, are signaling across that same kind of scale.
That's a really compelling unifying thought, and it even leads to a speculative but fascinating idea. Maybe human appearance, shaped by sexual selection, also satisfies some standards of objective beauty, contributing to what we find attractive.
The chapter then distinguishes applied beauty, clear signaling function like a good user interface, from pure beauty, art for its own sake, like pure science. It argues both pure science and pure art are, deep down, seeking universal, objective truth through good explanations. This applies to all art forms, even if the explanation isn't explicit, like that feeling that changing one note would diminish the music.
It also notes the similarity in developing specialized language in art, poetry, and science math, both striving for efficient, precise expression. And the book argues pure and applied art can feel the same subjectively, but discerning between them matters for unlimited progress, which is only possible towards objective truth. It connects this to historical views, like Greek art focusing on reproduction skill, and utilitarian theories, arguing artistic improvement is as objective as mathematical truth.
The chapter critiques the idea that art is just self-expression. Objective art involves creating something new, not just conveying the subjective. Spontaneous acts lack the error correction needed for progress.
And it ends with this truly mind-boggling vision for art's future. Unlimited increases in beauty, new unifications with other knowledge, even designing new senses to experience currently inconceivable beauty. Referencing Nagel's "What is it like to be a bat?" It's a really expansive, inspiring view of art as discovery.
That was breathtaking. Why flowers are beautiful. Objective beauty.
Huh.
Lots to chew on about art and nature. All right, choices, beauty. That leaves our final chapter for today, chapter 15, the evolution of culture. Another fascinating journey, I suspect, into how shared ideas develop.
It is indeed. This chapter dives into cultural evolution, starting with defining culture itself. Basically, a set of shared ideas, often called memes, that make people behave similarly. And the book stresses ideas here as broad: explicit knowledge, implicit values, language, skills, philosophy, tastes, anything affecting behavior.
And it makes that crucial point. Memes are rarely held identically by two people. Because of errors in transmission, misunderstandings, difficulty conveying implicit stuff, this constant modification leads to variations, schisms, and movements or beliefs.
Exactly. So a culture, in practice, is really a collection of these slightly different meme variants. Some versions are just more likely to get expressed, talked about, and replicated than others. The chapter then distinguishes short-lived fads from long-lived memes, successful ideas replicated accurately over many generations, forming the basis of lasting cultures.
And from that base, the book asks two fundamental, really thought-provoking questions. First, what makes a meme long-lived and successful at replicating? And second, when do memes change for the better, leading to actual progress in a culture? Seems vital for understanding societal evolution.
They are absolutely central. The chapter then acknowledges the older idea of cultural evolution, pre-memes, but warns against simplistic analogies with biological evolution. It mentions Marx misinterpreting biological competition as historical class struggle and how fascist ideologies dangerously twisted survival of the fittest to justify violence.
The book is quite firm about the dangers of these direct biosphere culture analogies. While both involve variation and selection, the mechanisms are fundamentally different. It notes biological competition is usually within species, gene variants, not between them, and can lead to cooperation too, not just conflict.
That's right. The chapter argues strongly against these analogies because, well, the biosphere is often a grim place. Mapping its principles onto culture can lead to reductionism that erases crucial distinctions, like mindless process versus creative thought, determinism versus choice, and fundamentally right versus wrong.
The book insists that while biology and culture both follow variation and selection in theory, the actual mechanics, transmission, variation sources, selection pressures are vastly different. It stresses there are no direct cultural analogs for species, organisms, or reproduction. Genes and memes, while both replicators embodying knowledge, are profoundly different in function and outcome, similar only at that very abstract level.
The chapter cleverly introduces meme evolution using Asimov's story Jokester, where jokes seem to evolve without a single creator. A really relatable analogy shows how complex ideas or practices might arise gradually. Repeated transmission, small variations, selection based on success in being remembered and passed on.
It discusses how a simple story might evolve into a funnier joke through retelling. Maybe unintentional changes, maybe creative tweaks from many people over time. And the fascinating bit, even with creative input, maybe no single person fully understands why the final joke works so well.
This connects to individual creativity itself. The book argues the creative process within a brain is also evolutionary: conjecture, new ideas, and criticism, internal evaluation. Many cycles of this internal variation and selection can happen before an idea is ever expressed outwardly.
The chapter then tackles criticisms of the meme concept. It's vague, pointless, biased. It uses examples to counter this, like ancient Greek religion becoming mythology. Are they still the same memes? Or Newton's laws in different languages. The argument is these classification debates don't negate the concept's existence or usefulness. Like debating planet classification doesn't make planets disappear.
It also addresses the criticism that memes aren't stored identically. It argues faithful transmission in ways relevant to evolution is still possible, and it introduces memeplexes, groups of ideas acting as one complex unit, like quantum theory. The terminology isn't crucial, it says, but the idea of interconnected systems is. It also points out memes can't be infinitely broken down. At some point, copying fails. 2 plus 3 isn't a meme alone. It needs the context of math.
One of the most striking points. People enacting memes often don't consciously know why. Like laughing at a joke you find it funny, repeat it, but can't fully explain the humor. Or grammar rules, we use them correctly without stating the rule. The chapter stresses memes implicitly contain vast info-shaping behavior without conscious awareness. And people often invent false reasons for their meme-driven actions.
This leads to a powerful gene meme analogy. Both contain knowledge, often inexplicit, for self-replication, adapted through variation and selection, genes and DNA, memes and brains. But the copying mechanism is key. Genes are copied indiscriminately in reproduction, all or none. Memes must be expressed as behavior to be copied. The recipient sees the behavior, not the brain state directly. If a meme isn't enacted, it isn't copied.
That's a critical difference.
Yeah.
A meme has to jump from brain to behavior, then potentially to another brain. If the behavior isn't expressed or isn't compelling, the meme dies out. More precarious than gene replication.
Exactly. This alternation brain memory. Then behavior means memes face two selection pressures each generation. First, the memory must effectively cause the behavior. Second, the behavior must successfully cause others to remember and enact the meme. The book uses failed attempts to start religions as an example. Even with effort, if the prescribed behaviors didn't implant the core ideas in followers' minds, it failed. This counters simple explanations like child gullibility for religion's success.
The book argues the very persistence of long-lived memes, faithfully replicated for generations, suggests they contain significant implicit knowledge about effective transmission, human psychology, outcompeting rivals.
Which brings us to the selfish meme concept. Memes are fundamentally selected for their ability to get replicated and displace others. This might benefit hosts, culture, or species, but that's not the primary driver. Harmful memes can spread if they're good replicators. Examples given. Harmful political religious views, societies undermined by maladaptive memes, individuals harmed by irrational ideologies or fads.
It's a bit unsettling. Our thoughts shaped by selfish memes just focused on propagating, even if it harms us. But the book also notes meme replication within a brain isn't passive. We try out ideas, criticize, refine them internally. Many cycles can happen before transmission.
That's crucial. Meme generations can be much shorter than human ones, and memes spread horizontally, not just parent to child, so meme evolution can be vastly faster than gene evolution. This explains why memes hold so much knowledge accumulated relatively quickly in human history. It makes that final second metaphor for civilization misleading. Huge evolution has happened in human brains.
Paradoxically, despite this speed, meme replication seems less reliable than genes, because of the implicit content needing inference from behavior and intentional variations by hosts. So how do long-lived memes persist so faithfully? The book suggests their survival strategies address this very problem.
Exactly. Humans think, try to improve ideas, constant pressure for change. That long-lived memes survived this challenge suggests they have powerful stability or persuasion built in.
This leads to contrasting static versus dynamic societies. The book highlights the relative changelessness of most pre-Enlightenment societies compared to the rapid sustained change in the post-Enlightenment West. It admits short bursts of change happened elsewhere, famines, wars, but in static societies, fundamental life often seemed unchanging for centuries.
The book imagines a beneficial idea arising in a static society, say, a better hunting technique. It might spread locally, improve things slightly, but why didn't this spark sustained, accelerating innovation, the beginning of infinity?
And the answer, the book says, is that static societies typically have strong customs, traditions, taboos that actively prevent significant meme change. These enforce existing memes, discourage variants, suppress criticism of established ideas.
However, the book adds, even these powerful forces couldn't completely stop change. Unpredictable small deviations, the difficulty of stopping a clearly better variant spreading somewhat, slow, gradual change still occurred.
Which leads to the idea that static societies feature long-lived memes that evolve to resist change. They implicitly know how to ensure faithful replication by suppressing rivals and exploiting human psychology. While maybe offering some benefits, they're likely suboptimal, mainly focused on self-perpetuation.
The book clarifies the time scale. Static societies look unchanging on a human scale, decades, centuries, but slow meme evolution still happens over longer periods. It compares old Stone Age tools to Roman Egyptian tools, then to modern tech, showing the dramatically increasing rate of change from faster meme evolution in dynamic societies.
An important point, meme evolution tends towards making memes static, not necessarily whole societies static. Like genes, memes evolve for their own replication, not the group's good. Static societies arise because they're built on memes that embody some truths and cooperate to maintain stasis. The memes are often useful, just suboptimally, to their holders.
The chapter uses a stark meme virus comparison. Some memes benign, some minor effects, some anti-irrational memes actively damage hosts by disabling critical faculties. Unlike passively replicated genes, some viruses destroy host cells. The book likens this to memes causing self-destructive behavior, like copycat suicides.
The book argues the main selection pressure on memes is faithful replication. Within that, there's secondary pressure to minimize harm to the host's mind. A functional mind is needed for long-term enactment. This can lead to finely tuned compulsions, like specific religious fears, not general fearfulness. The psychological damage is confined but deeply entrenched.
A static society forms, the book describes, when all significant behavior and thought get subordinated to faithfully replicating dominant memes, suppressing critical faculties, innovation, leading to stagnation, unaddressed suffering.
It uses the Black Death in Europe powerfully, highlighting harmful memes that emerged divine punishment, blaming Jews witches, self-flagellation, which actively hindered rational responses.
The chapter concludes static societies survive by eliminating creative variation aimed at meeting individual needs or solving problems. Meme evolution there more closely resembles grim gene evolution. Violence settles issues, individual welfare is sacrificed for the good of the memes.
Contrasting these with dynamic societies, dominated by creativity and new knowledge, it notes primitive societies often faced a choice: become static oppressive to preserve knowledge, or risk losing it and disintegrating. Not much room for happiness pursuit. Static societies unnaturally suppress the natural human need to create knowledge.
Anti-rational memes in static societies eliminate individual choice about ideas, causing stasis. Once stasis breaks and people choose, memes face unpredictable selection.
This introduces rational memes, ideas useful for diverse purposes over time, relying on thought for faithful replication, like Newton's laws, versus anti-rational memes surviving by disabling critical faculties, fundamentally different replication strategies.
The hobgoblin story illustrates this. A rational hobgoblin meme faces criticism, might evolve into fiction or focus on real danger solutions. An anti-rational one uses fear, exploits vulnerabilities. Its truth content, do hobgoblins exist, is irrelevant. Non-existence might even help replication.
The chapter stresses mixing rational and anti-rational strategies is usually bad for a meme's success.
A rational meme's natural home, a dynamic society valuing criticism and truth. An anti-rational meme thrives in static societies.
The Enlightenment is presented as the start of the West's transition from static to dynamic. Maybe beginning with Galileo, irreversible with Newton. Newton's laws were prime rational memes successful due to utility, high fidelity because testable. This success highlighted the power of science and reason.
The subsequent avalanche of improvements made returning to stasis impossible in the West. It had to become the beginning of infinity or be destroyed by its own changing knowledge.
And it argues non-Western nations are also undergoing rapid change via Western memes, unable to return to stasis. They must become Western in operation, dynamic, knowledge-creating, or lose out.
However, the book cautions the Enlightenment is incomplete, even in the West. Great progress in physical sciences, political economic institutions, open to criticism, but many areas still rely on anti-rational meme replication, gender stereotypes, prejudices.
It uses the seemingly trivial example of fashion, sock colors, to hint at the narrowness of conventions, social costs of violation. Makes you wonder about more important life patterns.
The book explains the transition from anti-rational to rational dominance is necessarily gradual, unstable. Creating knowledge for a stable, dynamic society takes time, trial, and error.
And the coexistence of rational and anti-rational memes creates instability because each impedes the other's replication, leading to phenomena peculiar to our transitional era.
Examples: anti-rational systems evolving towards rationality, constitutional monarchy; anti-rational subcultures forming within dynamic societies; racism based on suppressed criticism; education stressing critical thinking but using rote learning, leading to superficial understanding and paradoxical beliefs; laser tech plus supernatural energy.
The book critiques existing meme accounts for often missing the crucial rational-anti-rational distinction, leading to incomplete, sometimes implicitly anti-meme views, even while acknowledging valuable knowledge is mimetic.
It specifically challenges Susan Blackmore's view of the human condition as almost solely meme-driven, arguing it downplays individual creativity in meme origin and replication, questioning the dismissal of the heroic inventor.
The book contends the evolution versus heroic invention distinction is mainly valid in static societies. In dynamic ones, innovations are generally creative acts by individuals. Evolution happens within the mind, creativity, not just via transmission.
And it challenges Blackmore's apparent denial of objective progress. Biological evolution lacks direction, but developing explanatory knowledge is objective progress.
Ultimately, the chapter offers advice for living with memes. Be aware of potential errors and even strong beliefs. Respond to meme influence like any potential error, conjecture, criticism, seeking good explanations. Memes hide, but explanation and observation can detect them.
It highlights warning signs of anti-rational memes. Complex, narrow behaviors accurately repeated, thwarting personal goals, continuing without justification, explained with bad reasons.
Emphasizes suspicion towards conditions favoring anti-rational memes. Deference to authority, static subcultures, suppressing criticism for truth. Advocate examining institutions with Popper's criterion. How well do they allow removal of bad ideas via criticism?
The chapter concludes powerfully. The Enlightenment marks explanatory knowledge becoming dominant. Sustained knowledge creation is unprecedented. We're transitioning from passive recipients to active agents of progress in a rational society universe.
That was an incredibly insightful deep dive. Choices, beauty, the evolution of culture. Seeing how they all connect through knowledge creation, transmission, and selection.
Absolutely. Think back to the apportionment problem, those obvious solutions leading to paradoxes. Doesn't that echo other complex issues? And objective beauty, does it change how you view art or nature?
Definitely. And this rational versus anti-rational meme framework. It's a powerful lens for understanding forces shaping our beliefs, individually and societally.
We really hope this sparks some new thinking for you. What stood out most? What questions are you pondering now?
Join us next time on The Deep Dive as we continue exploring more fascinating concepts. Until then, keep those critical thinking skills sharp, stay curious, and keep diving deep.